Hello and welcome to the Child Psych Podcast. I'm Tania Johnson.
And I'm Tammy Schamuhn.
We're psychologists, moms, play therapists, co-founder of the Institute of Child Psychology, and thrilled to be here with you today.
Yeah, today we're going to be talking about something that's really timely considering it's the beginning of the school year. We're recording this in September. And I know Tanya and I personally struggled with this one as moms. And it's about putting our kids in childcare, whether it's a nanny, a day home, daycare, when it's not us in charge of our children anymore. We're giving them to someone else to it feels like to raise them, but really it's just a temporary piece. And I think it causes a lot of stress for parents.
It's interesting. So this is actually a question that we receive because we often receive questions from parents. And this is one that comes through intermittently. Every few months, a question will come through about basically, is it okay? Am I hurting my child if I put them in daycare or day home? So this is something that I think is universal. And I think for many parents, it often pulls at those heartstrings. It really tugs at those heartstrings.
Yeah, every parent wants what's best for their child. And I think if you're asking yourself that question, you're probably doing a great job as a parent. I think that's one of those pieces. It's a hallmark of a decent parent is we constantly question, like if we're in the right lane and if we're doing the best thing for our kids. And we want to learn more. And that's probably why you're tuned into this podcast. And that's what we're gonna share with you is a little bit of the research and talk about ratios and, the quality of what childcare should look like, in our opinion, based on our work with kiddos and families. And when we were doing our own research for our own child's care.
Yeah, Tammy, before we jump into that research, actually, we've got by Dr. Sarah Brain, we have this beautiful blog post on why it's so hard to sometimes let our children be cared for by other caregivers. And it's because we have this really instinctual wiring to keep our children close. And so when we start to often extend that village, we have an internal response and an internal reaction. And often it's just about reframing that narrative and starting to look at it from a different perspective and understanding that it's very natural to have those feelings inside.
And I think the biggest thing for me was looking at the fact that we are what sociologists call a cooperative breeding species, which there's a better name for that. It's called alloparenting, which means there's supposed to be a village. And I think every parent has heard that it takes a village to raise a child. And the question is, do we know the village in which our children are being raised in? And I think that's the biggest thing here is that, humans are designed to share the load with other adults. There's no question about that. That's within our collective culture for thousands of years. I think where we run into maybe some issues is when we don't know the people who are raising our kids very well. And I think that's where the trepidation is. We weren't designed to do that. And that's the fear is, we're not supposed to leave our children in the hands of strangers per se. And that's what's really tricky about childcare when we decide to move, whether it's a daycare or a day home. And I think that's where the alarm bells go off in our head a little bit is because we don't have that relationship with these people yet.
Absolutely. And I think within Western culture, at least, parenting really has, for many people, become this solitary dance where we're not used to having that village, which is where we all initially came from.
That's a good point too. Like we end up just kind of isolating. We don't know our neighbors. So it feels like it's all on us. We don't have the support of parents or aunts and uncles and those pieces. So it might feel very foreign for parents to have their child with someone else. I think that might be key too. Never thought of it that way, actually. That's probably why it is hard for a lot of parents to make that transition.
Beautiful. Okay, so Tam, you jump into some of the research on what it actually means to put our child into daycare or day home and kind of the impact that has for parents.
Well, I think the research would point to the fact that if your kiddos have a secure attachment with their parents, that is the biggest indicator whether or not they're going to be okay in childcare setting. So if the parents have a warm, consistent, and responsive relationship with their child, and that child feels connected and safe, and they've had, some time with that parent, the child is easily soothed by that parent, then that child will more easily be put in with other adults because basically the narrative is my needs are met. Like adults are consistent. They respond to me. I'm kept safe. I'm fed. I'm picked up at the right time. I'm soothed. I'm played with. There's what they call serve and return responses where, a child cues the parent, the adult makes a smile, makes a babble, says words, and the adult responds with eye contact or repeats back what they say or asks questions. So if those are the kind of responses your child is used to when you put them in with the other adults, they pretty much assume adults are going to give them that return back, that serve and return, that dance, that attachment dance back. I think what's even more difficult is if kiddos are in a stressful environment or the relationship is a little more insecure, that transition to other adults, just like in school, just like any setting, is going to be a little bit more difficult. With our kiddos, they either will be resistant or, there's some crying. But like, I think it's important to know that within I want to say the crying, because this is the thing that comes up as my kid cries. It's okay that kids cry during a transition to a new place. We know this based on Mary Ainsworth's study on the strange situation, that securely attached kids, when put in with new people, a stranger, someone they don't know well, tend to cling. They cry. They make a rebuttal. So that's actually a sign of a secure attachment. They're easily soothed by you, not by a stranger. The alarm
Beautiful.
bells initially go off with
Yeah.
our kiddos, with these new people. So I always want to let parents know you're looking at, a solid several weeks to adjust to this environment. But if we see in caregivers in these day homes or daycares where they're warm, responsive, and consistent, so it's a similar sort of dance that they start to put into place to your dance, kiddos are going to adapt quite quickly to that. Here's the caveat though, and this is where it's tricky. I think the biggest caveat is it the same person responding to your child? So Dr. Gordon Neufeld talks about matchmaking. He talks about putting our child with someone where we have time to get to know them. Before we put in, I know my son with his nanny, and then it was a day home. I spent time with that person. I got to know that person. I was there for the first several times there was a drop off. I actually stayed in the day home. I stayed with the nanny. So our children get to see that we approve of this person. We're making eye contact. We might use, I touch them on the shoulder. We laugh together. And that's kind of indicating to my child that this is the person you go to. I approve of this person. And that's not always in some day homes or daycares. That child might be with different, especially daycare, might be with different adults. There isn't a go-to person. And herein lies we're stuck a little bit. If you can be choosy, that you have a daycare where your child there's a match made, this is the person who's in charge of the infants, or this is the person in charge of the toddler room. And that child can rely on the fact that it's the same person, that when they become dysregulated or something happens, that's their person. This is going to work so much better.
Oh, I love that. So that person really just becomes that anchor for that child when you're not there.
Yeah. But when we have, some of these, and this is where I think our bias is going to come in for Tania and I, we would probably choose a setting with fewer children and a single caregiver, whether it's a nanny co-share, a day home, simply because we know it's that person is in charge of that child. We know it's the one person. Now, some daycare, I worked in a Waldorf daycare in the United States for several years during grad school. And it was always the same people in the infant room or in the toddler room. They had a teacher. So now there's sometimes more than one, but we matched the kids. So it was consistent that I was usually in charge of 2 to 3 infants, and same with the other when I was in the infant room. And then the next day, we worked full time with this. So I think there's that piece. And then you would graduate actually with the kids as they moved up the next year into the next classroom, they would call it.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. So, they had that consistency throughout the year. Obviously, there's turnover. We have to consider that, but they did the best they could with being consistent in who was working with the kids. And I just think that a lot of daycares and day homes, for that matter, they're not all created equal, and they're not always versed in attachment. They don't understand there needs to be that consistent face, or at least 1 or 2 consistent faces, that when that child kind of falls apart, which all children do, does that child know who to go to when things get hard and they miss mom or they miss dad?
Absolutely. Well, Tammy, I even think for me as a fully grown adult with most days a fully developed brain, if I'm upset or I'm sad, I need my person. If I'm in a whole group of strangers and nobody really knows me, it's scary. It's really, really scary. So imagine for our little ones, just how incredibly important it is to go, this person gets me, and they know that when I'm sad or when I'm feeling stressed out, this is what helps me. They know me deeply. They see me deeply. I'm not just another head in the daycare situation or the day home situation.
Yeah. And so to me, I did just, and I can, Tanya, you can talk about your journey if you want. I went through actually all three. I went through a nanny, I went through a day home, and then once my son was in elementary, I actually, for 1 year, just the 1 year, we had to rely on a daycare because the day home closed and like everything was full by October. And for us, there was a lot of interviewing that went on, especially the day home and the nanny situation. Like I spent a lot of time interviewing, spending time with people to find the right fit. And it made me a little bit nervous when they wouldn't allow me to come in and observe, like especially the day home, like when I couldn't come in and see what they were doing and have coffee with them and just get to know, what is your take on screen time? Are there screens? Is there TV? What do you do if children are fighting? Like a lot of questions to make sure they were aligned with how I was parenting, which, not all caregivers are going to be okay with you interviewing them like that,
Absolutely.
and same with the nanny, same thing. We talked a lot about, she was a mom too, and her kids were actually present when she was nannying. And we got to ask a lot of questions about how she raises her kids and what happens when they, they won't sleep or when they have a meltdown or, like what if, just to see, not to tell her she was wrong or right, just to make sure it was similar. So my son would experience consistency across the environments for me was so important.
Absolutely. And, for me, when we interviewed, it's what we've touched on already. My gut instinct of how I felt with this person was foundational. And then after that, it was, let's talk about screens, let's talk about nutrition, let's talk about nap time, stimulation, all of those extra things. But at the very core of it was, how do I feel with this person right now? And then trusting that gut instinct.
Yeah. Do they feel like home?
Yeah. Do they feel like home? I love that.
Yeah. And I'll be honest with you, I pulled my son out of 1 day home, but he was old enough to say that she said some bad words. So anyway, it was interesting that, to watch our kids' reaction to different people, right? And granted, you have a child, I've seen him with strangers. I kind of know how he is with new people. And then, if he's left with a babysitter. So that might be an idea too for parents, is testing the water out with a babysitter, like a neighborhood kid, and just see how your child does with that. And so we start to get kind of used to the drop off and leaving them and, coming back, and they know you're coming back, and what that looks like can be a really good idea. I also think when we think daycare, because I know a lot of parents like the idea they're licensed, and so day homes scare people. I think for a variety of reasons. I think they worry about things like sexual abuse or domestic violence. They've heard some story about some day home being investigated, but I also know daycare is being investigated for the exact same thing. And it's these ratios that make me a little bit more nervous with daycare. So I think it just depends on like how they're following the guidelines, because there's maximum group guidelines where depending what state you live in, depending what country you live in, what province you live in. And then there's like the recommended ideal ratio. So if we're looking at like ideal, it's for infants, it's 1 adult for every 3 infants. Like that's kind of where you want to be. But the maximum allowed in many states and countries, Canada, US, is 6. And to me, that's scary, 6 infants and 1 adult. So just because they're adhering to guidelines based on provincial regulations doesn't mean that's ideal. So then we go into toddlers, 1 to 2 years of age, and that is 1 adult to every 3 to 4 toddlers. Now, I hate that it's 3 to 4, so I'd prefer to err on the 3, but 4 I'm okay with. The 2-year-old, so once we get past, so now we're looking, between about 3 years of age, then we're looking at about 1 to 5, 1 to 6. So that's what we're looking at there. And then your preschool, about 4 years of old, we don't want, about 7 to 8 at that point is we're okay with at that. And then your kiddo going into kindergarten, we're okay with, sitting at 8, and about 8 to 10. Think of, we'll say 20 is the max in a lot of places because you think of like kindergarten, right? But I also see kindergarten students with 30 kids in a classroom. So I think we're just looking at what can be. I think the older kids have more autonomy. They can be more independent, but the younger they are, we're looking 0 to like 3. Those ratios need to be a lot smaller.
Beautiful. I love that. I know too, like alongside ratios, for me, when I was considering childcare for my girls, was the level of stimulation that they would be around all day. And, for us, I knew that I needed low stimulation, lots of time outside. And then as play therapists, I know you and I are like completely the same on this. There had to be lots of space for play.
Yeah. So how do they utilize, do they have green space? Like, do they have outdoor? That's huge for me, is like, do the kids get to go outdoor like a lot? That to me is very, very important. Looking at the lighting, like, is it all fluorescent lighting? Like, or do they use lamps and soft lighting? Do they have, what kind of toys do they have? Are they electronic toys, or are they a bit more of I always think like Melissa and Doug, like wooden toys
Open-ended
and
toys, yeah.
open-ended dolls, building materials, sensory-based bins and sand and water, things they can explore with are very important to me. I was not okay with screens. So
Me
I
either.
said
Yeah.
no TV and no screens. And if that's what we're using, I just wasn't okay with it. And that was just a personal choice for me as a parent. I think you felt the same way.
Absolutely. A big one that I always ask about too is discipline. If there is a problem, what happens and how is that handled? And on a couple, so it's a little bit different, but when my kids went to preschool, there was something there that about the kids will be asked to separate by themselves if they're having a hard time, which I was not okay signing off on. So it's just really looking at the policies and going in and saying, this is what I believe needs to happen with my kids. If they're struggling, this is what I want to happen. This is my involvement that I want. So being very clear and making sure that it aligns with your values.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. Like I said, we've done all three, and definitely have my preferences having a smaller ratio and the same person for sure. But I realize that's not always practical. It's not always affordable for parents. But I think if we decide to go the daycare route, parents can be picky, like they can start looking at this just as, to talk with the manager, the director, the owner, whoever it is. And you know what? I've seen a lot of these places now have video cameras in them. So you can actually see what's going on, which is incredible if you can monitor and, make sure that these things are actually happening. But that's not always the case. So I think we just have to do our research and our due diligence. And the biggest thing that comes up to me is keeping the numbers low, making sure they're not overstimulated, and they have that warm, responsive, consistent caregiving, if all possible, with the same person or the same couple people when things get tough, that play with them and engage with them and get on the floor with them, not just, leaving kids to, just run amok. That they're engaged, like they're very engaged. And we know that first couple years, like that 0 to about 3, even upwards to 4, kids should be playing with the adults. It's not about being socialized with peers. I mean, that gets them used to being with other kids, absolutely, and gets them used to separation. But the most growth happens in the brain, and that safety occurs when the adults, the caregivers, are with the kids, on the floor with the kids. So is that kind of play going on where kids they do parallel play with other kids, but are the adults engaging and interacting with them? Making Play-Doh with them and playing in the sand with them and with puppets, and like really getting down with the kids is going to be important for their psychological safety, and so they can explore, that the adults do get involved.
Beautiful. I think it's Dr. Gordon Neufeld and Dr. Matei, they always say security before socialization. So we just help our kids to like really anchor into who they are, and then we focus on those socialization skills. Whereas often we have a topsy-turvy in Western society where we push they need to play with others. So we put that socialization before the security. It has to come the other way around.
Yeah. And I want to know, and Tan, you can jump in here because this is kind of your arena, is highly sensitive kids. When I think of, and we've talked about highly sensitive kids on the podcast several times. You can tune into any other past episodes on highly sensitive temperaments. But our highly sensitive kids, what I have seen in private practice is they often don't do well in a large daycare setting. Just saying. I have seen a lot of kids come in, the parents are concerned about their mental health. The second we switch them to like a day home or a nanny share or something, then all of a sudden they're fine. I just find some of those kids who may be on the spectrum, or which is not the same thing as highly sensitive, by the way. Sensory processing disorder, also a different thing. But some of these things that make the kiddos a little bit unique in how they handle sensory information and other people's feelings and emotions, that absorb a lot or have maybe a hard time processing some sensory experiences. Daycare situations can be sometimes a little much for them. And sometimes when they're really struggling, that just making a simple switch to a less chaotic environment can completely shift things.
Yeah. Absolutely. Trust your gut on that. You think about you, if you're going into a workplace every day that felt constantly overstimulating, how would you respond? What would that be like? And with our kiddos, often that response is behaviors. And then unfortunately, we often see that we end up treating the behavior or punishing the behavior instead of going, hold on, maybe where my child is spending many of their waking hours every day isn't actually working for them.
Yeah. So I think moms and dads, grandmas, grandpas, foster parents, whoever's listening, we're all doing the best we can. And we know in this economy, it's very difficult to stay home. Things are very expensive right now. But at the same time, we just have to do our due diligence and think, start looking at what environment is best for our kids. But also know that it's okay for other people to help out. It's okay to have a village. It's okay to have other adults helping you raise your kids. We just want to make sure those adults are safe and that they're remember that warm, responsive, and consistent with our kiddos.
So give yourself a little bit of grace. Remember, quality time over quantity. That's what actually counts here. Being present and attuned to your child and those beautiful serve and return processes that Tammy spoke about earlier. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. See you in our next episode.